Phil, you begin to allude to the importance of perhaps young people seeing providential God, that can be a way that young people can navigate anxiety. I wanted to know if you could unpack a little bit more how significant a young person's image of God is when they think about, or when they're experiencing anxiety. How can it both contribute to anxiety, but also how can it actually become a resource to help them navigate through the feeling of anxiety?
Yeah. I'll tell a brief story about my own youth ministry. I was teaching a group of kids, junior high and high school, about the cleansing of the temple, and Jesus driving everyone out. This is Jesus, not God, but same point. Jesus driving all the money changers out of the temple with a whip. And all of a sudden, and I asked the question, do you think that people were afraid of Jesus in this moment? And I had one kid who was from an abusive background, and his mother was trying to leave an abusive relationship, who said, absolutely not. No one is ever afraid of Jesus. And it was like, that was sacred to him, like a Jesus who could protect, who could care. I think he talked from his experiential core of his image of God in Jesus. And we also have kind of confessional images that we carry with us. So there's kind of the conceptual image of God that we get from the tradition. Then there's the experiential image that sometimes comes out more when we sing or pray. I think there's a range of images for God in the Bible, and some, even the violent ones, can be surprisingly helpful sometimes for people who've experienced trauma, to pray some of the Psalms of vindictive rage. And it's strange to accept all of that material, which isn't in our lectionary, but there may be a place for that. It looks like there's also, you can track, there's different images of God that people go through as they experience more safety, and there's scales of images of God that people carry around in their heads. And when people start to get better and start to get well, their images of God transform as well. I could say more on that, but I want to give you some space if you had any thoughts too, Allan. Anything on that?
Yeah, so I teach in a school of social work, and several classes I teach, we talk about anxiety, and not surprisingly, students will often identify their own experiences with anxiety and with struggles with anxiety. Some of these students would identify as religious or spiritual, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, something, a kind of major world religion. But many of them would identify as spiritual but not religious, or seeking after some higher truth. I mean, they would use their own language for it. But not in every case, but in many cases, the way they think about their own experiences with anxiety and anxiety conceptually relate in some form or fashion to what I would call a sort of spiritual understanding of that experience. Maybe not religious, but spiritual. And so my own research has focused on folks who find themselves in churches and are anxious, but also folks who would identify as being anxious or have been identified as being anxious, who aren't in churches or who aren't members of organized religious communities, but nonetheless would identify as being spiritual or seeking after something that's sacred or transcendent, or God, as we classically would name that experience. And oftentimes I've found that that their struggles with anxiety will relate in some form or fashion to their understandings of who God is, or the higher power, who that God is, the nature of that God, whether that God is punitive or loving or forgiving, or violent or angry, or not. And also their relationship to that God, whether by virtue of who that God is, how does that God relate to the person himself or herself? So that gets framed in a lot of different ways. People use lots of language to get there, but I've found, both anecdotally and in research I've done, that it's a very common theme among people who identify as being anxious or who are identified as being anxious, that there's a spiritual component to that. And oftentimes, because there is, they are seeking for some sort of spiritual practice or habit or resource to help them through that. And so they may find themselves in youth groups, as in the case of younger people, or congregations, or other kinds of spiritual sort of entities that people seek out and find because they see a place there where their experience would be understood, perhaps, but also where it could be ameliorated by virtue of their own sort of spiritual journey.